viewers and listeners out there in podcast land. Welcome to the latest episode of Extra Extra. It's all about whiskey. I am your evening Extra Extra host, Jason Johnston Yellen, and he is our evening co host, Joshua Morrissey Hatton. Hello, Joshua.
It's interesting having a conversation with you in the evening time.
It's late in the evening as well. This is
It's
our
really late.
prime Netflix beef viewing time.
It is. It is. I got 2 more episodes to go.
But listen, this is Extra Extra, not One Nation Under Whiskey.
This is not One
We're
Nation
gonna
Under Whiskey.
we are going to dedicate a tight 35 to this. We have been good boys about this, and we continue to be good boys. Joshua, in our production meeting, our lengthy, research-filled production meeting,
Mm-hmm.
you told me that we have an emailed story to cover this episode.
That is
So
correct.
would you like to tell me and the viewers and the listeners about said email?
I will indeed. I'm going to bring it up on my phone, trying to protect my Wi-Fi on my laptop here. But we got an
Do you know what's good
email.
for that?
Huh?
Do you know what's
What's
good
that?
for that?
What's that?
If you save it as a PDF and keep it on your desktop, you can access it without touching your Wi-Fi.
I'll tell you, I laughed at you for being an old man. And I will continue laughing at you for being an old man. However, I see the
And yet,
value. Yeah,
and yet.
yeah. So we got an email from Ian Bruce, viewers and listeners. I'm
Familiar?
sure we'll know that name.
Yeah, we quoted him in the last episode of Extra Extra, didn't we? He had a
Could be
comment
right.
on the blended malts episode that we did.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Indeed. And so Ian sends this over with the headline "Possible Extra Extra Story." Says, "Hey folks, so this posted by Backwoods Distilling and thought it may be an interesting article to cover." And he leaves it at that. And
Oh,
the
that's
article,
it. Oh gosh,
that's
there's
it.
no
I like it.
editorializing.
It's
Oh,
no foreplay. It's just straight to the article here.
wow.
And
Wow.
so the
Gets in,
article is
says
from
it, gets
this,
out.
yeah, it's in the Sydney Morning Herald that this comes from.
This excites me. I was happy to see this come in because we've been talking about casting an eye outside our United States national boundaries and having Australia appear from down there. Perfect timing.
Well, yes, and it is nice to cast an eye away from the US. However, I will argue by the time we get to the end of this episode, I think we'll find a clear connection between what's going on in Australia right now and what we've been going through in the US, and hopefully we'll have resolved. So from that Sydney Herald, here, let's do this.
Ah,
There's your headline right there. Whisky Business, 120-year-old law sparking a war over the name single malt. And I'm guessing they use the term war figuratively.
I
That's
I
just a
hope
guess.
so, but don't turn your back on Tasmania. That's only a
Because they have all
fool
the
turns
devils
their
down
back
there.
on Tasmania.
Yeah. So it kicks off with this, right? You've got 2 distilleries. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the first one. You want to try that,
Well, we
Jason?
have to because we've got listeners.
Oh, jeepers creep.
Not
Oh, we
everyone can
do.
read the banner.
All right. So I'll read this aloud. Sydney-based Goodragidby. Goodragidby?
Can I tell you
Goodragidby.
how I would pronounce it?
Go ahead.
Goodradigby.
Goodradigby. All right. Sydney-based Goodradigby distillers. Yeah, you just gotta go with it.
Plough through. Yakindanda. Kirkcudbright in Scotland.
Yeah, James Hendigus. So
That's a great.
Sydney-based that distillery company and Mountain Distilling, based in regional Victoria, are calling their product single malt to get around the restriction
Mm.
in the Excise Act of 1901, which was a good 122 years ago. And what that act dictates is this:
That was some
whiskey,
impressive
brandy.
math on the fly, Joshua.
That was easy, man. That wasn't impressive. That's
It's,
easy.
you got it right. That's impressive.
So, unlike Scotland, for whiskey to be called whiskey in Australia, Tasmania, and New Zealand, that spirit must stay in cask for at least a year to call it whiskey. And that's what that rule is, that Act of 1901.
2 years.
Yeah. What did I say?
One. A year. You said a year.
Oh, I
two
said, yeah,
years.
I meant the
Yeah.
2. I meant the 2.
Yeah.
But it doesn't what it doesn't stipulate is this: unaged spirits, or spirits basically fewer than 2 years, the law doesn't define it against single malt. So you can call single malt. You could use that willy-nilly.
Isn't that
And
interesting?
isn't yeah, it is interesting.
The fact that in 1901 they were thinking, okay, whiskey, we got to
Yeah,
nail this down. And they said, okay, it must be a minimum of 2 years in storage, right?
yeah, yep,
And then they went, oh, whiskey, check. What's next? Brandy? Okay, same rule, check. What's next?
yeah,
Rum? Check. All right, boys, let's go. We've done it, right? Our work day is
yeah.
over. And 122 years later, somebody using accelerated maturation cubes would come along and say, oh, I know you're talking about whiskey, but what we've got over here is single malt.
Hmm.
Do you
Yeah, so
think
let's
that people coming up with the Commonwealth legislation could imagine that happening 122 years in the future?
let's rewind a little bit here, right? So you've got these 2 distilleries that are producing single malt, right? They're producing a spirit, and they're using these maturation cubes. I guess they used red gum cubes and some others.
One did, yeah, one
And
did.
yeah, one did, and was able to produce a spirit that they called single malt in 14 days, and so it doesn't meet the legal requirement of 2 years. And then I think there was a 8-week project they did, that they said got the whiskey to look as if it was a 12-year-old, single malt Scotch whiskey. And so, to get around the fact that they can't use the term whiskey, they use the term single malt, which some people find confusing.
Right, and rightly so. The question that I've got for you, Joshua, do you recall in reading the article if they mentioned a mash bill? Are they using 100% malted barley distillate, or are they bringing in neutral grain spirit and adding their maturation cubes? Do you recall seeing that in the article?
No, there was the article, to my mind, I don't recall it touching on mash bill, just focusing on length of maturation.
Right, right. Yeah, the reason I asked the question is I don't recall seeing a mash bill mentioned either. I don't recall going over 100% malted barley spirit that's then being rapid aged. The reason I'm
Well,
asking this question
yeah,
is
go ahead.
where are they pulling single malt from? Like, why are they calling it single malt? And is that obviously I know they're doing it to get around a regulation, but is there something about their process? Is there something about their mash bill that would allow them to lean into what we understand as single malt?
Well, unfortunately, the article doesn't say as such, and maybe, this story just recently broke, right? So I imagine more is gonna come out from this. But I find it interesting, single malt. is not a category in the US yet. That's something we're working towards, American single malt. And so we're only now codifying what that should be called. And the only reason why it's become important to do so is because of the popularity of single malt that started in Scotland and extended to Japan and in India and so on. And single malt has become something so singular that we're now in the US trying to protect it as a category, as a specific thing. And I just don't think that Australia has gotten there yet. And that's the battle that they're about to embark on.
So let me ask you a question on that because who's the Kentucky producer who was producing a single malt, but it's not 100% malted barley? It's just
So they weren't
51% or
producing.
above.
Yeah. So that's the thing. We here in the US have had a category called malt whiskey.
There it
And
is.
malt
There it is.
whiskey, just like bourbon or rye, right? Bourbon, 51% corn, rye, 51% rye. Again, these are minimums in the mash bill. And malt was 51% malted barley.
There it
So
is.
American single malt is specifying the use of only malted barley from a single distillery.
Yeah, it's interesting looking around some American producers. I am seeing single malt products where
Mhm.
it's malted wheat. And you could see the beginnings of this argument, right? Well, it's a single malted grain, it just happens to be wheat. And so you can see the importance of a TTB ratifying what it actually means to say American single malt whiskey, right? You just close it down, you say 100% malted barley, single
Yeah.
producer, matured on site, minimum number of years, boom, there you go. It's a real game changer. And I think this Australian example shows how a loophole can be um, well, taken advantage of. I hope those words aren't too extreme this late at night.
Well, I always want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And, in the article, the one of the producers, either from the distillery I can't pronounce or from Mountain Distilling,
Good Digby.
um, Goodra Digby, had said, we understand how this can be perceived as problematic. However, we're using this until there's some sort of categorization, some sort of specificity applied to these spirits that haven't yet hit that 2-year age statement. So, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, given he said that.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it might have been a she who said that, but again, it's. Um,
Yeah, maybe. But
yeah, it's.
yeah.
I'm actually looking back
Yes.
at Lee Atwood's quote here. Lee,
Yeah.
who is a dear friend, along with his wife Bree, down at Backwoods in Yakindanda,
Yeah, I
and
think I got it
and
right here.
so right, and so Lee says these brands leave the term whiskey off their labels, but consumers see single malt as whiskey regardless. Therefore, the practice of these brands is misleading and deceptive. And so the idea that well we're just using it as a placeholder, I I I just find that difficult to believe. When and you already said it in this episode, single malt
Mm,
has done an amazing job globally, right?
yeah.
We know about Scottish single malt. Gosh, look what we bottle, right? Swedish single malt, Israeli single malt, Indian single malt, American single malt. We're drinking American
Mhm.
single malt right now, right? We drank American single malt in the last episode, right? Like, I just think it's a little disingenuous to say, well, we didn't really know what to call it, so we called it single malt until we could think of something better. Like, what about unaged, accelerated whiskey like
Well,
product,
right.
right?
Right, this that is such the perfect example because you are right, one of the things that I
It's
always talk
unwise.
about one of the things I always talk about when I'm doing a whiskey seminar and I explain, why bourbon producers sell their casks to the Scots or to rum producers or anyone else is that if they were to use that barrel again, they would have to either distill the spirit to a higher ABV to create light whiskey, which is a not very popular category of spirits, or they could put it in that cask and call it something like American whiskey or American whiskey from a bourbon mash bill. And the fact of the matter is, we don't drink American whiskey. We drink bourbon, we drink rye,
Right, right.
right? And so that's why they say, okay, yeah, no one wants to drink spirit from 100% barley mash bill matured with, m- it's accelerated maturation cubes. Let's call it single malt. So okay, there you go.
Right,
I'll stop
right.
being so Pollyanna about it. Okay.
I did double check, and you were talking about Mountain Distilling co-founder Michael Harris, who is most definitely a he. I was thinking about Manley Distilling later on in the article, where it's
Uh,
a Victoria, I believe, and we will come to that in a moment here. But
I
but
know
to
a
get
woman
Harris in
named
here,
Michael. Just putting that out
right,
there, Jason.
right, Michaela, is how I refer to it. No. We've got a little bullet here. And so this Michael Harris said the legal definition of whiskey should be expanded to allow for new types of whiskey that had alternative maturation techniques.
Hmm.
And that's spot on. That's absolutely spot on. And I made the joke earlier in this episode, right? In 1901, they went whiskey check, brandy check, rum check, let's go to the pub, right?
Yeah.
We do live in 2023, right? We've had a conversation on One Nation Under Whiskey with the folk from Bespoken, right?
Hmm.
We've spoken with Brian Davis on One Nation Under Whiskey, right? People who are using modern maturation techniques to do something beyond the remit of
Yeah.
traditional single malt production, right?
Yeah.
How do we talk about those products, right? What can you call that? And I think most importantly, what can you not call it? And I think that's to your earlier point about why you would want to ratify American single malt so that it can mean something. You can point at it when somebody tries to bend the rules and say, no, you're bending the rules. Right now, the article talks about consumer confusion, which is
Yeah.
correct. It also talks about distillers who have spent the money, the time, the energy to do long form traditional maturation, who then
Hmm.
look over their shoulder and somebody has popped in a cube for 14 days. Like you can see that animosity to that procedure.
100%. I and however, to your earlier point and to earlier point of one of the interviewees, if you were to create subcategories of spirit, then that animosity goes away, right? Then there's if whiskey has a protection,
Mhm.
right? Single malt should therefore have a protection, or single malt Australian whiskey, single malt New Zealand whiskey, etc., should have specific protections. It's no longer 1901. We're 122 years later. There's different types of whiskeys, different kinds of things going on.
Check you.
However, back to how important single malt has become. There was
Hmm.
a quote from the Corowa distillery managing director. Let me bring that up. It says, I think that we, as the Australian whiskey industry, need to hold on to the term single malt like gold, like gold. And anyone trying to use and abuse the term to be kicked to the curb, right? That shows you how important that term single malt is and should be protected just as much as whiskey is a protected term.
Right, which is again why I think Michael Harris saying we didn't have anything better to use in the interim falls short. Right, if someone at Corolla here, Dean Druce, can say we need to
Yeah.
protect this like gold, There's people talking about single malt in Australia. Right? It's not just someone in Australia woke up one day and went, single malt, yes, I'm going to own that. Like, no, it's already there. It's already in existence. It already means things.
Right, and as you're trying to lift a category against all of the
Hmm.
imported product that comes in, right? You don't want to lessen what single malt could be, which is well, I'm not going to take us down that rabbit hole. Never mind. I'm gonna withdraw what I was
Wow.
going to say. We only have
Wow.
35
Wow.
minutes. I gotta
Wow.
restrain
Okay.
myself, Jason. Here.
Well, okay. So if you're not going to throw your hat into your particular ring, let me throw my hat into my particular ring,
You do you?
which is in the early days of American single malt whiskey production, still to be ratified, there was rapid aging. There was small casking. There were additional wood spirals being used. And it makes allusion to this in the article, right? It gives you incredible color really quickly, but it doesn't give you really good whiskey really quickly.
Correct. That is 100% correct. And this was the rabbit hole that I didn't want to go down, right? Which was I mean, as the category is has been written and is soon to be ratified, there's nothing that talks specifically to a minimum age statement.
Mm,
And there are arguments on either side, you know. Part of me says, well, it should be at least 3 years because that's what the Scots do. But then
mhm.
another part of me says, yeah, but what about the folks in Texas who have a
Yeah,
completely different climate,
mm,
right?
exactly,
Or in
exactly,
Virginia and so on. And
exactly.
so there's America is too big a country with too many maturation or climate zones, I should say, to have to incorporate everything. So not
Right.
including the age statement can be a good thing for our
Which,
case.
but I think that comment about the size of America holds true for the size of Australia as well, right? Multiple climates, multiple terrains,
Fair,
right? And
fair.
so
All
they,
right.
in 1901, they went 2 years. Right? Let's put 2 years on that in Australia. So I'm definitely with you, right? You don't want to tell someone whose product is climate dependent what the minimum should be in that climate. I think you and I could sit here on this episode and agree that 14 days probably isn't getting it done, and 3 months
Well,
probably isn't getting it done. Six
now,
months
well, here's
probably
I
isn't
I
getting it
would
done.
argue I would argue I would argue that some of Bespoken's spirits are perfectly quaffable.
So
And
I'm only talking traditional maturation. I'm not
yes, so
talking 21st century technologies.
I get that. I get that. I think the larger point, which is the one we can't really answer because it needs to take into consideration modern technologies, is if whiskey was protected by 2 years for for quality reasons, then single malt should be protected in some way for quality reasons, especially as a budding category, Australian single malt. But you can't really. What am my point is here in the US, we've gone through 10 plus years of companies trying to create some sort of rapid aged product. In early days, it wasn't that great technology's improved, things have changed, and now there's perfectly quaffable stuff. I just don't know how that applies to Australia as they try to protect single malt and the quality aspects that are linked to single malt. If this is a term they want to hold on like gold, right?
Yeah, I'm. Does the ASMWC have? Because I know they didn't go down the minimal sized barrel designation either, right? It's not just well, apparently the URL is not asmwc.com, so let's just do a good old
No, that
fashioned
brought you
Google
somewhere else.
search.
I hope you had safety changes.
It's American single malt whiskey with an e.org. And
There
we
you go.
have right here made from 100% malted barley, distilled entirely at one distillery, mash distilled and matured in the United States of America, matured in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 liters, distilled to no more than
Standard.
160 US proof, 80% alcohol by volume, bottled at 80% proof or more, 40% alcohol by volume. Now that's the commission. The
Mm,
TTB went through its question period where they
mm,
may take other concerns on board, adjuncts
correct.
being one of the components that TTB is taking on as
Uh,
well. But
Additives,
but
yeah.
right, but there's nothing there about 53-gallon cask, 2 years or 3 years. And I'm just thinking where those more modern technologies could fit in with the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission recommendations.
Yeah, that's a really good question because it talks specifically to oak vessels not exceeding a certain size, and
Right,
spirals,
right,
cubes, those aren't oak vessels, those are
right,
something quite
right.
different. So it sounds like we need to have a deeper conversation with our friend Steve Holly. Get some
Yeah,
clarification
yeah.
on that.
Yeah, so it's not just sitting on wood, it's
No, it's
actually
within
in
wood.
wood.
Yeah, yeah,
It's an
yeah.
interesting wrinkle. This is the part I like about this conversation. It's the part I like about this article coming in is their single malt category being wide open and
Mm,
potentially, depending on who you ask, being open to abuse. Really got me thinking back to, we're so excited right now about the ratification of American single malt whiskey, but it had me going back, as I just did here, to these suggested regulations to say, well, did you think about covering that? Did you think about covering that? And I know one aspect of it is they don't want to curtail experimentation, right?
mm,
There was some talk
which is
there
great.
comparing it to the SWA, right? When Campus Box, who we mention every week, and we get no money from John Glazer, when they were unable to use the French oak staves, right? That wasn't allowed, and then they moved to the heads, and that seemed to be allowed. So there was some wiggle room there. But it is this: do you try to solve every future problem today, or do
Mm,
you get language on record that you can start building upon and start pointing people to, and then take on a case by case basis the opportunity to say, listen, we're really trying to do something with this category. How about you come on board with us? Would you like to join us in this, and not go down the, you know, scorched earth approach of legal ramifications when somebody steps outside the tent.
let me ask you a question. It's a bit tangential, but I think it's quite apropos. Then
Mhm.
it goes back to something that you had said. Jeez, it could have been as far back as episode 1, but you've mentioned it a few times since, but not in a good while. And it
Okay.
was something along the lines of, I wish craft whiskey had its
Mm.
own category. That you couldn't necessarily call it whiskey, but you call it
Mm.
something else because it has its own value, but yet it's quite different from what we currently know as whiskey. And so I'm curious if you've thought about that and if you've updated thought on that.
Yeah, yeah. The original quote was along the lines of, I wish America had come up with a different word for its whiskey than whiskey. Given that bourbon is so radically different from
Yeah,
single
yeah,
malt, right? Given
yeah,
that
yeah.
rye is so radically different from those other two, and then craft producers came on the scene, and it felt like craft producers were trying to achieve something. They were chasing down a dream, right?
Mm,
But we kept coming along with whiskey boots on and going, well, your single malt isn't like they're producing in Scotland. Your bourbon isn't like they're producing in Kentucky. Your rye isn't like they're producing in Kentucky and other parts as well, right? It just felt like they were not on an equal
Mm,
footing. You know,
mhm, mhm.
when you're trying to put private money into a venture and you're being compared to some of the biggest global brands, it seems unfair to call that product whiskey, right? Just across the board.
Yeah, yeah.
I will say, however, that there are producers out there, and this is globally, right? Craft producers globally who are starting to do things that I am glad their product is called whiskey. And it does have the same jumping off point as that category allows. It doesn't make it easy for us to sell it necessarily. You and I
Mm,
have talked a fair bit over the last few weeks about doing individual tastings where I had a Swedish single malt and an Indian single malt and an American
mm.
single malt, and after telling somebody that, they asked me where in Scotland they were made. And so that's a that's, that's a moment
That's
when
a
I
whole
even
other
wish we
ball of wax. Yeah,
that's when I wish we weren't even using the word single malt. But there's value, right? As this article
yeah,
alludes to, there's such value in that term single malt. It means something for a mash bill, right? It means something for a consumer expectation. So yeah, I agree. Who was it we said over here? I scrolled away from it. Dean Druce
Dean
is
Drews. Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah,
Single malt should be protected like gold. And anyone trying to use and abuse the term needs to be kicked to the curb. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely spot on. Um,
yeah.
real quick here, Joshua, and obviously we're talking about
Yeah.
American single malt as we're going along. You have, as I have, the single cask nation, or I should say in this instance, the double cask nation. Copperworks single malt in your glass. Here's without looking at the label.
Oh, go ahead. I'm not looking at the
When
label.
when did we bottle this?
Oh, jeepers creepers. We bottled this. It was in 2022,
Check.
and I want to say that it was likely around this time last year. Like
Oh,
was it
interesting.
springish time?
It was not. And the reason I didn't ask you this question as I got you, I just because we talk constantly about time and how does time work and who
Mm,
knows what time is ever since the pandemic. I was just curious if you had any sense. And I say that as someone who looked at the label and said, "Oh, that's when we bottled that." It was
all right.
August of 2022.
August. Oh wow. Look at that. And right in two casks. Two casks, 3 years of age each, New Chart American Oak. This one, Jason, if you remember, and maybe the viewers and listeners remember, this was my single cast nation whiskey of the year.
Ah, then the quote I'm about to share with you, I probably shared potentially in that episode of One Nation Under Whiskey where you announced that. Very dear friend Bert Bumgardner, who's up in the
Mm-hmm.
Palouse in northern
Yep.
Idaho, had dropped me a text after he'd received these bottles. And he'd said, and it's one of those great quotes that starts so honestly that it really, the honesty is a bit like nails on a chalkboard, to be honest. But the text starts out saying, "You know how I don't like American single malt whiskies."
Oh shit.
Go
Yeah.
on, Bert. I hope there's more to this text. Um, he said, but this is a game changer. So you and I have
Mm-hmm.
heard people, and Jess as well, and Sweet Scott, of course, Steve Hawley, who you mentioned earlier, Matt Hoffman, Anna Hintz, have heard people the world over say Westland is a game changer.
Yeah.
Bert, not a fan of Westland, Copperworks, game changer in the
Yeah.
category of American single malt whiskey.
It's is so I don't disagree with him. I mean, what makes a game changer, right? I mean, it really it's anything that flips it on its head, right? You have a
Hmm.
perception that this thing will always taste like this, and then someone changes your mind. I had one. For years I said Glenrothes was the distillery I
Mm.
liked the least, and then
Mm.
David Stirk turned us on to some amazing Glenrothes casks, sold us a
Hmm.
couple amazing Glenrothes casks, and now I actively seek out Glenrothes because I got it, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what Copperworks is doing is quite different from Westland. It's
Yeah.
so
Oh, yeah.
bright and crisp and clean and pretty. Um, how do you find this one? What are your Do you remember your
Uh,
tasting notes on this one?
oh, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. It's orangey. It's orange gumdrops. It's orange creamsicles. But, and I've been saying this ever since we selected it. When you and I did the Indiana light whiskey that we
Mm,
finished in the beer barrel with the mustard seed and all that malarkey, that light whiskey allowed the hoppiness of the beer to shine through. And
mhm.
even though, obviously, this has no hops in it, it
I'm
has that a quality in common with that light whiskey that I loved so much. And to your point, it's the brightness of it. It's quite floral. It's quite citrusy. Obviously, I said orange three times in about 6 words, right? It's
mm,
citrusy, but it's not cloying, right? There's
no.
such a bright cleanliness to it. And so for me that's almost like that bright citrus of a hop oil, right? That cuts right through. Yeah, I think it's a cracking anything that
So
can get someone who's
yeah,
disregarded a category to reinvestigate a category. I think that's doing something good.
yeah, I agree. I agree. I had a local tasting, with some friends and their group, and there was one guy in the group who's a wine drinker. And he's sold wine, right? He's been in the industry. And we got to the point where we poured the Copperworks, and he pulled me to the side. He said, "This is what white wine drinkers of good white wine,
Mm, mm,
this is what they look for. It's got
mm.
the acidity coming through, that bright, crisp fruitiness
Mhm,
without it being overly sweet, without
mm.
the oak overtaking the fruit from the
Hmm.
wine." Like, he was just really waxing lyrical, and he said any
Huh.
white wine drinker would just fall in love with this. And I just
That's
yeah,
that's
yeah, I
interesting.
like that. Yeah.
Not, again, not to get too tangential before we get out of here in a tight 35, but when I first
Mhm.
presented our original Aaron to Bill Thomas at Jack
Mm.
Rose Dining Saloon, he tasted that and said, "This is going to be perfect for the wine drinkers." Right? It was that Pinot Noir finishing on that Aaron
Yeah,
spirit,
sure.
and that Aaron spirit, as you and I've talked about, citrus, baked apple, right?
Yeah.
Brightness to it. And
Yeah, a
then a
lot of
bit of
orchard
the
fruits. Yeah.
Pinot Noir going on round about that. So yeah, not the first time I've heard that type of comment, but great to hear it applied to the Copperworks as well. Huh. All right.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
l-
I love it.
yeah. Listen, we pitch other people's products on a semi-weekly basis here. Semi-weekly or bi-weekly? I always get that mixed up. Every two
But
weeks, every fortnight.
there
Every
you
fortnight,
go. Yeah, every fortnight. That's what we say, every fortnight.
right? Every fortnight, we pitch someone else's product. This is ours. This is a double cast nation. This is sitting on our website. I think it's $95 a bottle. Please
Yeah.
go pick up a bottle. It would do us a solid. For all this free entertainment we put out over the airwaves, whether you like it or not. If you would like to be like Ian Bruce and let us know about a story worth covering, please drop us an email, questions at onenationunderwhiskey.com, no Ian Whiskey, or drop us a note, info at singlecastnation.com. something's something's
I
happening over
keep
there.
kicking my
Keep it down
table.
next
I
door.
keep kicking my
Keep it
table.
down. Keep it down. Um,
Our
yeah,
listeners have
please.
no idea what we're talking about,
The
but yeah.
listeners have no idea that Joshua just had a Connecticut earthquake there. Smash the subscribe button as I am contractually obliged to inform you. And please look out for us in a fortnight.
Oh, I thought you were saying please drink the whole bottle response. Yes, buy a bottle of Copperworks, maybe 2, right? $15 flat rate shipping, and then
Hey,
drink the whole bottle
also,
responsibly.
and we just talked about Lee Atwood at Backwoods and Yakindanda. Talk about hashtag please drink the whole bottle responsibly. So join us in a fortnight. We will be back to do this again. Until then, cheers and peace.
Cheers and peace. Peace and cheers.